Welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Jennifer Holmgren, CEO of LanzaTech, a disruptive, revolutionary carbon recycling company using the power of biotechnology. Now, Jennifer, she's a rare breed. She has a PhD and MBA. She's author and co-author of numerous scientific publications and patents. She's been decorated both personally and with the company with a number of corporate awards related to green chemistry, sustainability, and her leadership across the industrial biotechnology sector. Jennifer also sits on a number of boards related to biotechnology and renewable energy. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jennifer about 4 years ago back in San Diego, briefly at a bio event. And look, Jennifer, it's great to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure, Simon. Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to chatting.
Excellent, excellent. So maybe I'll start with taking it all the way back, really. Just thinking as you were kind of growing up, what the major kind of influences were that helped shape your ideas and aspirations.
Yeah, so I think you know that I was born in Colombia. And so when I was young, that was actually my ecosystem, shall we say. I grew up at the time of the space program, the United States space program, which I followed on a daily basis. And I can tell you that is, I think, the biggest influence and my inspiration to go into science. Like everybody else around then, I wanted to be an astronaut. Didn't quite turn out that way, but I did stick with the science part.
Great. And when you say it didn't quite work out, were you, did you try going down that road, in terms of training?
No, not really. I'm a klutz, and I'm pretty sure I would not have made that. That cut is for folks way above me.
But it helped you when it came to looking at science and, no doubt, resources and.
Absolutely. I think the space program teaches us more than anything else that I've lived through that innovation, especially cross-disciplinary, science and technology is super important. And I would say I wouldn't have understood what cross-disciplinary or anything like that meant at the time, but certainly I can see big problems being solved by scientists, right? By technology, engineers, chemists, etc. And so that, I think that's pretty much what set me on this course.
Great. And what did your parents do? What were the parental influences?
Yeah, so my father, mechanic in the aviation industry. So I think my love for aviation came from that. My mom was more in finance, so accounting and such. She spent a lot of time, though, as helping us grow up, right? She stayed at home for some of her time. And I think a lot of the education and my love for education came from her. That was something they really emphasized in the family, especially my mother, really pushed all the kids, do school, do better in school, sit down with us on doing homework and all of that. That was my mother.
Yeah, great. And how many siblings do you have?
I have 2 younger brothers.
Okay. So science, I mean, it sounds like it was a passion. You found it and it was a passion. Well, I mean, you went on and did a PhD, for instance. It was in chemistry, right? Your PhD.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
What were what were you thinking at that stage towards a career?
No idea at the time, actually, to be honest. I really like chemistry. I actually like chemical engineering. Ended up getting a degree in chemistry, and I'm not sure I know people plan their careers now. I didn't actually plan my career or how I thought about things, right? I knew I had to go to college. When I got to college, I learned about PhD programs, and I loved chemistry, and it was obvious, I went to Harvey Med College, and they really emphasized the PhD program and the importance of that, and learning to learn, learning to do research. And it was sort of like the next logical step to go to grad school. So that's why I got my PhD. In retrospect, that was really important because it gave me the opportunity to really learn to do research. But when I went to undergrad, I don't think I even knew what a PhD program was.
Right, okay. But at that time, though, when you did your PhD, did you always foresee a career in industry, like a commercial industry, as opposed to an academic kind of path?
Yeah, and that's right. And Simon, I always used to focus on solving problems, and I always used to say that it would be great to walk down, and at the time I had gone to chemistry and something that would work in the chemical industry or refining, and I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool to walk down a refining facility or a chemical plant and be able to point to a process and say, I helped either invent that or develop that or scale that up. And that's not really something that you can do in academics, right? You have a different, very different path there. And that's what I always imagined myself being able to say, hey, I did that. The reason that works is because what I learned contributed to me doing that.
Yeah. Okay. No, great. Now, clearly, your career, well, certainly the last 10 years, but also just looking a little bit beforehand. Tell us a little bit about the renewable energy and renewable chemicals journey, when you found it, where you start maybe working with it, and just give us a brief view of how all that fitted together within your career.
Yeah, so I used to work for UOP, which is part of Honeywell, and they developed technology for the refining sector. And at the time, I managed our kind of exploratory long-term R&D portfolio. And I started to get into alternative feedstocks. In a world that needed to diversify from oil, what could you use? And interestingly, at the time, natural gas was one of the things people were talking about. So I looked at natural gas, but then I started to realize, wait, we have to actually get away from fossils. It was in around between 2000 and 2005, I started to realize that energy, so I used to focus on what I would call energy democracy. I wanted to figure out, with alternate feedstocks and other approaches, how do you make sure everybody has access to energy? And it was only in the 2005 period that I realized that, that isn't going to cut it. It has to be clean energy democracy. So even though natural gas was considered an important feedstock and people called it a bridge feedstock, I didn't agree with that. And so I started really focusing on renewable feedstocks like waste biomass, or even first generation like vegetable oil. So I could tell that first generation wasn't the future. So it couldn't be something that competed with land or food. I knew it would have a role to play, okay, because everything has a small role to play at least. But I started also focusing on pyrolysis of biomass, all of these types of technologies that used waste. So I would say it was around that time that I started to think about what are the feedstocks of the future, and it became obvious to me they had to all be waste.
Yeah, interesting. But the business, though, within that you were running at UOP, for instance, and then they got acquired by Honeywell. Am I right in thinking that's?
Yeah, yeah, so UOP was part of Honeywell. And so what I did was, once I started to really look at feedstocks, alternate feedstocks, we made a lot of progress in making diesel and jet fuel from these alternate feedstocks. And so we were also making progress in pyrolysis. And so we agreed as part of UOP to establish a renewable energy business, renewable energy and chemicals. And the reason, actually, and I think this is really important, at the time, we established it as a separate business unit rather than put it inside one of the businesses, is because we figured you could never compete with the core for resources. And so our CEO and I at the time talked through that and realized that what we needed to do was establish a separate business. And he agreed to do that. And We launched a new business inside the company. And really that is, if you look at today what Valero is doing with the eco-fining, Total just announced an eco-fining process. That's what we did then, that we developed that process technology. It was really pretty cool, actually.
It sounds excellent. And I mean, 2005, I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday. And, you know, when we think back 15 years ago now, right? And, but what was the environment in terms of, clearly you had a vision. You had a vision for renewable sources. How different was it in terms of communicating that vision and getting people to really, you know, understand the impact and want to move forward with it compared to where it is now, maybe?
Yeah, no, actually at the time it was really different, right? I mean, I think, you know, what we've had $9 billion storms by the middle of this year. I don't think anybody was thinking about climate change or really alternate feedstocks at that time.
Right.
At the time, I remember people said the price of oil will never go above $35 a barrel. And so people were talking $15 to $20 a barrel, and they would laugh at you when you'd say you wanted to look at an alternate feedstock. Fossil is going to be around forever, you know. And it was a tough sell. That was actually one of the things I learned at that time in my career is usually you need to go as high a level in the organization as possible. Often your immediate supervisor, manager, whatever, doesn't quite get the bigger pictures. And so being able to articulate a bigger picture and work it up the organization is how you get support. And I always found that the higher the level I went, the more likely they were to appreciate a vision of creating something new, something different. But that was also when I learned in my career that you don't ever go into a meeting unless you've convinced everybody of your position, because otherwise it just goes off into hyperspace. And so influencing people and convincing them to do something new. I spent a lot of time at that time doing that.
Yeah. Okay, no, interesting. So when LanzaTech came along, I mean, it was just the most perfectly set up kind of, when I look at it now, I think about what you love and what your passion is, and all of a sudden this company with this technology solving these problems, it was like a match made in heaven, right? It really was. I mean, it's, yeah.
Yeah.
It must have been very different from working for a company like, you know, where you'd come from. And then all of a sudden you're CEO of a venture-backed kind of startup almost, you know, it's,
Yeah.
you know, how different was that on the journey?
Yeah, it was hugely different. I didn't appreciate how hugely different it would be when I took the role. Obviously, I took the role because of the technology and thinking that I could help turn it into a platform. But once I took the role, there was kind of an oh shit moment. You know, how do you get stuff done in an environment like this? And how do you build the infrastructure you need to grow it? And, you know, one of the things I really learned, and this is actually interesting, people that really excel in a large organization often excel because that infrastructure has been created for them and they know how to use the infrastructure. In a small company, you need people that can excel at building infrastructure from scratch. And it's all of your systems. And that doesn't mean you invent them in a vacuum. You don't invent systems in a vacuum. But the guts of a system, the way you have to understand them to be a procurement person at a startup company versus a Honeywell is completely different, right? You're constantly improving at a Honeywell. At a LanzaTech, you're constantly creating, even your infrastructure. It's a totally different mindset and it's a totally different skill set. That doesn't mean that some people can do both. Some people can do both extremely well. Some people walk both worlds extremely well. But I found over and over again that hiring somebody who was awesome at a large company didn't mean they'd be awesome at LanzaTech. And that was a hard learning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But with yourself, with personally, your adaptation to that, how did you find that? And what helped you kind of really adapt, because you've never been in a situation like that before.
Yeah, I think you're right, Simon. But also in retrospect, I spent a lot of time in my old job doing startup-ish things, right? It was always the trying to get something new going, whether it be the combinatorial chemistry business, working with the new fuel cell business, all of that. If I then look back at my entire career, I would say I was an intrapreneur versus
Mhm.
an entrepreneur. And because of that, and obviously it wasn't obvious to me then, the adapting wasn't that hard. Um, and the big lesson is always, if you're trying to do something new, it's a battle of attrition, right? And that was actually true then in my old job and in my new job. You just got to keep fighting for what you want.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, the fight. It's all about the fight, isn't it? It sounds like. So tell me a little bit about, for the viewers, for the audience, a little bit about LanzaTech with relation to, the vision and the mission and the real problems that you're looking to solve.
Well, I mean, we have developed a platform that allows you to convert all sorts of waste, whether it be gaseous waste at a steel mill or solid waste at a municipal solid waste facility, right? And we basically like to say no carbon left behind, because we really believe that to solve the carbon problem, we need to leave all of the carbon in the ground and figure out how to convert all the carbon that's already out of the ground. We also have always believed, even before it was in vogue, in the circular economy, right? Everything has to be reused and not in a linear pathway. And if we were to articulate a vision, we don't articulate it around climate change or greenhouse gases, because if you don't combust things, if you reuse them, you also clean up the air. And and from an emotional perspective, what always grabbed our attention is that certain parts of the world, India, China, and a lot of others, the sky isn't blue. It's never blue. It's seldom blue. And so we always used to say that what we wanted to do is make sure that every child could paint the sky with a blue crayon. Okay. And so that's actually how we think about it. It's not a greenhouse gas exercise as much as it is greenhouse gases, particular emissions, and everything else that goes along with this wasteful carbon economy that we've created and grown up around.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And maybe talk a little bit about the technology as well, and give the
Sure.
viewers a view on how it works, as it were.
Yeah, so what we do is gas fermentation. So we have an organism that eats carbon monoxide, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, instead of eating sugar. That's what you're used to, is the fermentation of sugar to make beer. We do exactly the same thing, except without the sugar. And so these types of gases you can find in a steel mill, in a refinery, in a chemical plant, but you can also find them when you take waste materials, solid materials, and you gasify them. So literally incredibly abundant, which means that you can really start to substitute for today's fossil feedstocks. And that was really part of the motivation to move, because I could see that you could get all these resources from waste rather than virgin feedstocks, whether it be virgin oils or virgin fossil petroleum oils. Um, the technology is actually kind of cool for a couple of reasons. When you do regular fermentation, sugar fermentation, you do it in a big batch process, and we do our fermentation in a continuous process. Continuous processes, continuous reactors are very efficient, and it's what's used in refineries, right? So this process looks more like a refining process than a fermentation process. So that's another element that makes it attractive.
Yeah, no, great. It's incredible to think of these microbes, isn't it? Essentially, it's just, you know, it is incredible, isn't it? What they're able to do and how it works, as it were. And when you mention about the vision and you talk about the blue skies in India and China, how realistic is that? And what can your technology, how does it need to be deployed in order for you to achieve those, you know, that really great objective?
So actually, when we calculate how much impact our technology can have, if we think about it from a greenhouse gas perspective, if we could deploy it everywhere we think you could deploy it, we talk about being able to impact 7% of global carbon emissions, which is huge. But frankly, that's not enough, right? And so we never think of our technology as being the solution. We think of our technology as a solution, and we need a lot more, right? And so that to me is actually the other thing I always try to make clear. It's not one technology versus another, one approach versus another. It's every approach. And I hate to say it, but if somebody can come along with something incredibly better and more efficient and whatever, I would welcome that, because we're trying to solve this monster problem and we need it all and we need it fast.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And but you mentioned India and China. Is that where most of, because you've been on a journey towards commercialization, right? So you have a number of your would we call it a plant, or I know your technology kind of sticks on to a steel plant, for instance, isn't it? Is that what you
Yeah.
would refer to as a plant?
Yeah, no, I refer to our technology as a plant too, right? It's a bunch of steel in the ground that converts A to B. So it's very much like a refinery or a steel mill that does some type of heavy duty process technology. Our first commercial plant is in China. It is operating. It's been operating for 2 years. Um, we say we've reduced emissions, mitigated CO2 emissions by about 100,000 tons already. That feels like nothing compared to what needs to happen, but I think it shows it's possible. We've made almost 20 million gallons of ethanol at that plant. So really showing that gas fermentation can be scaled. And that's important because people said that was impossible. Everybody thought gas fermentation was like a toy thing, you know, you just play with it in the lab. So what we've been able to show is you can scale it. We know it's economic, and the reason we know it's economic is our partner in China who built that first one is building two more. The first one's at a steel mill, the second one is at a ferroalloy plant. So I think we're starting to show a lot of things about, you know, commercializing a disruptive technology, one that people said wouldn't scale. And what I hope more than anything else is it inspires other people to do the same thing.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. So no doubt, if they're producing all this ethanol, they're in the market selling this now, right? And are they needing to create their own relationships and their own supply chain when it comes to, you know, the selling of the ethanol?
Absolutely. So they sell it into the local market in partnership with the local oil companies, and they distribute it as a blend stock with gasoline. Um, so that's what it's being used for now. We have also started to export some of that ethanol, small amounts, for chemical applications. So we just launched a product with Mibel Group where they use our ethanol. We clean it further beyond what you would need for gasoline, and they use it in household cleaners in the home. We also have just worked with Total and L'Oreal to make a plastic bottle for shampoo made from our recycled carbon ethanol. We launched a company called LanzaTech, where we are taking ethanol and converting it to sustainable aviation fuel. And we flew a plane from Orlando to Gatwick with Virgin Atlantic, where we used some amount, about 10% of the fuel was our recycled carbon fuel. So we're trying to show actually that ethanol is a feedstock, that, you know, you can't move all these wastes from all over the world to a central location to convert them, but you can convert them to ethanol at those distributed locations where the waste is. And then the ethanol becomes the energy and carbon carrier from those feedstocks. And then you can turn that into other things. You can turn it into jet fuel, into household cleaners, into polyethylene, PET, polyester, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's so, yeah, I think of ethanol as the feedstock of the future.
Yeah, it sounds good. Congratulations. I mean, it sounds tremendous. I was reading just before about the collaboration with L'Oreal and Total. And I think the thing that really kind of struck me when I consider the journey of companies over the last 10 years in this space is around bringing collaboration from across the value chain, essentially. You know, and that's what really struck me with that. You know, L'Oreal, Total, and yourself coming together, essentially. So that's really must be the nature of your job and the nature of the business you're in, to bring all these sides together to develop these solutions.
Absolutely. That's what you have to do if you're trying to do something different.
Yeah, yeah. And what for you over the last 10 years, because it has been 10 years, right? You joined the company.
Yeah.
Wow. Have you had your 10-year anniversary then already?
I have. June of 2010 is when I started with LanzaTech.
Yeah, wow. So I suppose I've got a couple of things to ask you about the journey, really. I suppose if you went all the way back then to when you started, but you know what you know now, what would you do differently?
Honestly, I'm not sure I was planning on spending another 10 years of my life working at the time. So
Yeah.
I guess if I'd known how long the journey would have been, or if I had really stopped and thought about it, I think in the back of my head, I probably knew. I wonder if I would have done it, honestly, being honest. But I think in everything you do, we have to move so fast, right? Because in a small company, you move or you don't survive. And, you know, I can't sit there and regret a specific item or think that I did. You know, I can't go back and redo it. I learned a lot of things, but I think the most important thing is everything you do, you adjust. Just do something, make a decision, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. If you make fast decisions and you make a mistake, then you can course correct quickly too, right? So it's all about moving fast, thinking fast, just carrying everything with you. Yeah.
That sounds great. But they always say when you start the mission, it's always more arduous. There's more hills than even when you're prepared for it. It's I don't have anyone, let's be to anyone that tells me actually it was easier than I thought, basically.
Neither have I. I
Yeah.
certainly won't tell you that. And nobody in the company will probably tell you that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose when you're disrupting and you're innovating to the extent you're doing, that's part of the course, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're
Yeah.
paving a new road. You have no idea what that road's going to look like when
Yeah.
you start.
Yeah. Tell me, what about the future from here then for the business when you think about the path to profitability, for instance, or where it can go in 2020, with also the whole promise of the green revolution now, which it seems to be in full swing in terms of discussion.
Absolutely. And I would say that's going to help a lot, because at least you don't have to pitch those attributes. At least those attributes will be understood as being important. One of the really great things that's happened over the past 2 years is large corporations have come to realize that they need to reduce their scope 3 emissions, which means there's a pull for products. And so what we're seeing is a lot of interest in lower carbon things you can touch and feel, not just fuel. People also want to offset their scope 3 emissions from taking flights, from shipping goods. And so I think there's a lot of interest, and people are starting to say, well, I'm willing to pay a little more. Carbon taxes haven't happened, right? And you really can't compete with an industry that's 150 years old if you try to put in something that's new and disruptive, right? Your cost of capital will be higher initially. You're lying to yourself if you think that's not the case. And so the fact that there are big corporations saying, I want to offset my emissions, or I want to reduce my emissions, and I'm willing to pay a little more, means that while governments are figuring out what to do with carbon taxes, you're able to command a slightly higher price, which helps you get a product into the market. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And have you seen that kind of evolve? Is it more recently, or would you say, over the last few years, or is this?
I would say it's grown in intensity over the past few years. 10 years ago, there were leaders, there were business councils and groups of people coming together as industry trying to figure out what they could do about this problem. But in the last 2 years, it's massive, right? The announcements from the big corporates, the Microsofts, the Amazons, um, they really have grown in intensity, right? Unilever just came out with a big announcement. You look at the list of companies and they're the big gorillas, and the big gorillas have really important supply chains that follow them. And so that's how it's turning. And now with the Green Deal and green recovery and all of these things, that will just add more, because that means the governments will also participate. But frankly, it's been industry that's been leading. It's industry.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Really interesting times. You're certainly seeing a lot more focus from, with the whole sustainability agenda now, and it's funny looking back at some of the biotech companies, for instance, that were established, back in the early 2000s, that really played into the biofuel space, and they were kind of decimated by the price of oil and the way that market kind of moves, and low price of oil really makes it really difficult commercially, doesn't it? So it's great to see a bit more kind of responsibility from the the various companies and governments there. So yeah, that's great to see. Tell me, I'd love to hear your experience as a female CEO working across a male-dominated industry, and just your thoughts and perceptions of that.
Yeah, that's something that's really changed, right? I grew up in a world where I was always the only woman in the room, right? And that means your life experience is very different than the other people in the room, and how you communicate is very different than how you communicate normally. And so it's a challenge, right? It's a barrier. And I remember telling somebody recently that if you're a female CEO, you walk into a room, you have to prove that you're the CEO. If a man walks in the room, it's assumed that yeah, he's the CEO. And it's a very, very different. I also look back at my career and I realized something, that because I don't normally think about being a female or not in this environment, because that just distracts you. But I remember thinking to myself, I got to a point in my career where everywhere I went, I would go alone. And I realized that I did that because depending upon where I was, if I walked into a room and I had somebody with me, say I was a vice president and they were a manager, and he was male, the person we were talking to would talk to him, not to me. And so my ability to communicate a vision or my work or what I really wanted to accomplish in the meeting just went up in smoke, because they weren't talking to me, they were talking to the person I was with. And so I stopped going places with people. It's only recently that I started, people realized who I was and what I did. That's when I started to be able to travel with others and let them take on part of the discussion and so on. It's probably, it's just, you just have to adapt.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But you probably need to be extra resilient, I would have thought.
Yeah, but if you're doing your stuff, you have to be resilient. So I don't know what makes you have to be more resilient, but yeah, for sure. And you also have to just take things, right? I mean, if every little thing is going to bother you, you're not going to make it, because I mean, you're definitely going to be treated differently,
Yeah.
and you're not going to like it, but whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, no, I'm sure it's been a change journey. I look back to the 1990s and late 80s, and it's so different. And so it's something that's evolving. It seems to be evolving a lot more. I get requested a lot more now on mandates I work with for more gender diverse kind of talent, actually, and I've seen that over the last few years. So there seems to be more focus on finding women, actually. And just final question for you, just thinking about 3 bits of advice that you might have for a CEO who's looking to scale a disruptive company. So maybe they were where you were 10 years ago as such, when you came in.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say number 1 priority is build a really good team. You really need people who are really good, who can get things done and think outside of the box, right? They all need to be really strong leaders. So that's the first thing. To be truly multidisciplinary, we are a biology company, but we have a strong engineering team, a strong catalysis team, a strong analytical team. You don't solve problems with people who all have the same background. That would be the second thing I would say. And the third thing I would say is you have to make decisions fast. You cannot, you will not get a 99% right. If you do, you've wasted a bunch of time getting there. So what you have to do is make decisions, listen, change course, make a next decision.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for that. That's wonderful. So, Jennifer, it's been wonderful getting you on the show today. It's been lovely talking. Really appreciate you coming on, and always keen to follow your journey, and I wish you loads of onward kind of success.
And thank you, and wish you success too. You are an important part of making journeys succeed.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say. Thanks very much.